From Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus.
Hello, and welcome to Middle East Focus, a weekly podcast on regional affairs and U.S. policy, produced by the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C. I'm Alistair Taylor, MEI's editorial director. On today's program, we'll be talking about the upcoming Iraqi parliamentary elections on October 10th. Originally scheduled for 2022, the elections were moved up amid pressure from the Tishreen protest movement that began in late 2019. They are the first elections to be held under the new electoral law, dividing the country into smaller districts, and they're set to take place against a backdrop of widespread dissatisfaction with the government and the political system more broadly over issues including the performance of the economy, service provision, and security. MEI Senior Fellow Randa will be talking to two longtime watchers of Iraqi politics, Farhad Alaaldin and Naufel Alhassan, about how they see things playing out and the impact the elections might have on Iraq's political landscape going forward. You can subscribe to Middle East Focus on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other podcast providers, as well as our Arabic language program, Podcast Al-Awsat, hosted by MEI Senior Fellow Ibrahim Al-Asl. From October 12th through 15th, MEI will be hosting its inaugural Middle East Futures Forum. This 4-day virtual conference will bring together experts and practitioners at the cutting edge of finance, energy, technology, and defense in the U.S. and Middle East to examine major trends and drivers that will shape the Middle East for years to come. MEI is proud to welcome Foreign Policy Magazine as media partner for this conference. To learn more, please visit www.mei.edu/futures. First up on the program, I'll be talking to Marsin Alshamary, a research fellow with the Harvard Belfer Center's Middle East Initiative, to get a better sense of who the key players are and what to look out for. Marsin, welcome to the program, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me today.
To start off with, could you set the scene for our listeners? Who are the key players in this election, and what's at stake?
This election is extremely momentous in Iraq's contemporary history because it is a point in which the public has reached a very high level of dissatisfaction with the political elite. So it's the entire legitimacy of the political system that is contested in this election, and that's at stake. Now, as for the participants, they are the same old faces, essentially, the same political elite that has been in Iraq and Iraqi politics for quite a while now. And in addition to them, there's also been an entry of new players into the arena that are the political parties that were based off the protest movement that occurred in Iraq in 2019. They don't constitute a large portion of the key players, but they are still a significant amount.
Marsin, what are the key issues that are being debated in the run-up to the election?
Well, one of the big differences between this election and previous ones is that this one utilizes a new electoral districting, where there are more districts in Iraq. So when Iraq first started with voting after 2003, all of Iraq was one big district. And then the districts became at the governorate level, and Iraq has 18 governorates. And now what we have is that we have multi-district governorates. And we're really interested in seeing whether this actually will lead to the kind of change that Iraqi protesters have asked for, and whether it will deliver the big issues that Iraqis care about, like better services, including critically electricity and water, but also things like healthcare and education. And it's also about, more broadly, whether this new system can hold representatives accountable to their constituents in a more direct and a more traceable manner. Because if the districts are smaller, in theory, they should be able to link between their parliamentarians and the local communities a lot easier. So the major issue that a lot of people are talking about in the lead up to this election is, will this actually work? Will it deliver? Or will it be manipulated by the political elite and result in more dissatisfying results?
What are the major hurdles to participation in the election? How much of a concern is voter apathy versus other issues like security or problems with the new biometric ID system?
There's a lot of barriers to participation in this election. And by participation, I mean both for the protesters that want to coalesce into political parties and run, and also everyday Iraqis. A lot of this apathy is a result of the accumulating pressure from years of not having seen any of their politicians actually deliver on promises and of actually not seeing major improvements in Iraq when it comes to key issues like corruption. So apathy is one of the big hurdles to participation. And the issue with apathy is that it is not just ideological boycott. It's not just people saying, I'm not going to boycott because I want to delegitimize the system, which is something that is happening, but it's also people just feeling tired, feeling like they don't want to invest in the logistical requirements of going out to vote. So this ultimately results in the same thing, but this is a major hurdle that's important. In addition to that, there's issues like pre-electoral manipulation, intimidation of activists, intimidation of people who want to run for office who stem from the protest movement or are independent. And this pre-electoral manipulation makes the electoral environment really not as representative as it could be of the Iraqi public. And then you also mentioned the question of the biometric IDs. The biometric IDs for voting, the entire point of having them was to reduce the ability to buy and sell votes and to keep individuals from casting more than one vote. But of course, the big issue here, as with a lot of biometric data, is who controls this data, who has access to it, and what are the long-term implications of the government having this kind of voter data at their disposal. I think that issue is less of a priority concern for everyday Iraqis. And it's a concern that specialists or people who are more in tune with the minute details of the election will pay attention to. But definitely the key hurdle here is going to be voter apathy and boycott.
Following up on that, what are your expectations for turnout, and how much of an impact do you think Grand Ayatollah Ali al-Sistani's statement the other day urging Iraqis to vote will have?
I think Grand Ayatollah Sistani's statement has a big impact on turnout, particularly because a lot of the boycott movement stems from protest areas, which tended to be Shia in the southern, and that's also where a lot of Sistani's followers tend to be. So it aligns as a response to that. But I do think there is a diminishment of Sistani's ability to move people beyond this apathy, and that this diminishment may not be at play for this election, but I don't think he can continuously keep using this card. I don't think he can continuously bolster voting in the future. But for this election, I do think it will have an effect. It's been said that a lot of people think that the whole point of his statement is to give legitimacy to whatever government forms. That could well be, a reason behind his statement, but I do think that people underestimate how many middle-class Iraqi Shia will actually be motivated by Sistani's statement to look closely at the candidates that are running in their districts and reassess their decision. Unfortunately, I don't think his statement can have a big impact on people who have long-term apathy, maybe residual apathy from 2018 that led them to not even register or to renew their voter cards. There's nothing they can really do at this point, even if they feel like they should be voting. It's too late for them. So that's an unfortunate reality around the timing of this statement.
How do you see things playing out moving forward, and what will you be paying particularly close attention to as you watch the elections and what follows?
Well, in the immediate future, one of the things I'm really interested in seeing is the statement that UNAMI and that the UN will release after the Iraqi elections. The UN did this very unprecedented thing where they said that they would monitor election day in Iraq. And because of their past participation, past help of setting up Iraq's electoral system, it's usually seen as a conflict of interest for them to intervene or to assist with such depth. But this time they've decided to go ahead and do it. But as a result of this, they are actually required to provide a statement following the election about how they think the election proceeded, whether they think the election has integrity, and their general assessment of the environment on the day of the election. And I'm really interested to see the statement that they make, but I'm also really interested to see how they market it to the Iraqi public, because the Iraqi public actually asked for UN supervision and UN intervention in Iraqi elections repeatedly. There was this call for it stemming from the protest movement until very recently. And I think there's always been a gap in how the UN presented its role and how Iraqis understood that role. And I'm interested in seeing the messaging around it, particularly because if Iraqis don't feel like the new government is representative and they think it's illegitimate and UNAMI has or has not endorsed it, will have a huge effect on UNAMI's reputation in Iraq. So I'm very interested in that. But stepping away from the role of the international community, I'm also really interested in seeing how many seats that the protest-based parties can cobble up in this election. To me, this is a great indicator of how viable reform from within political institutions is and how much it can actually happen versus having to enact entire whole-scale revolution to see any change in Iraq. So there's 5 protest-based parties that are contesting in this election, and they are running across districts in southern Iraq, but also in areas like Kirkuk, like Salah ad-Din and Diyala, which is a very vast array of Iraqi areas. So I'm really looking forward to see how they fare in different communities. I'm also interested to see how this new electoral district plays out in terms of, does it actually give an advantage to up-and-coming candidates, or is it easily manipulable by elites as people fear? In the long term, I'm interested in following how the decision-making around the prime minister happens. I'm excited to see how much there will be explicit versus indirect foreign intervention in the selection of the prime minister, about Washington statements, Iran statements, and even about the religious establishment and how they will push and pull for different candidates. So that's always interesting to watch.
Thank you very much for joining us today, Marsin.
Thank you.
That was Marsin Alshamary, a research fellow with the Harvard Belfer Center's Middle East Initiative. Next up on the program, Randa, MEI Senior Fellow and Director of the Conflict Resolution and Track 2 Dialogues Program, will be moderating a discussion with Farhad Alaaldin and Naufel Alhassan. Farhad is a writer and commentator on Iraqi political affairs and the head of the Iraqi Advisory Council. He previously served as a political advisor to Iraqi President Barham Saleh and former Iraqi President Fuad Masum. Naufel is an Iraqi politician and former official. He has served in many high executive and advisory positions in the government, including as chief of staff and senior advisor to Prime Minister Haider al-Abadi.
It's my pleasure to welcome to today's podcast to discuss the October 10 Iraqi parliamentary elections 2 friends and colleagues with whom I've had the pleasure to work and from whose astute analysis of Iraqi affairs I benefited over the years. Welcome, Naufel and Farhad.
My pleasure.
Thank you, Randa, and it's a pleasure to be with you, and thanks for the invitation and the opportunity.
Let me start with you, Farhad, and just get from you a feel for our listeners about the current mood in Iraq about the elections. How do people feel about these elections, and what are their primary concerns about the election process?
These elections came about as a result of the protest movement in 2019, which resulted in the resignation of the Prime Minister Adel Abdel Mahdi, and thereafter the country went through a new government formation process, and one of the requirements was to hold an early election. So this early election, which is the process took quite longer, so it's only 6 months away from the main election date, is a result of that protest movement. And the aspiration was that this election will bring about change, that we will see new system, at least, if not new political players into the game. However, it became apparent as we grew closer to the election day that this election does not really bring any change of significant value, and we're going to end up with more or less the same political parties that we had in the past. And as a result, one could say that the Iraqi people mostly do not look at these elections as game changer, or is going to lead to much of the change they required. So apathy is going to be quite present, no matter how much the political parties and others try to encourage voters to go to vote. It's one of the remain as biggest concern for the voters.
I was traveling between many cities, especially in the south, and in additional to Baghdad for last few days. I talked to many young people. It looks like the participation is going to be a little bit more than what I expected before I come to Iraq a couple of weeks ago. Generally speaking, I think, you remember in 2018, it was like a 44.5%. That's the official number, although a lot of people believe it's less than the official number. But I expect more than the participation in the previous election. However, I can clearly see some of the voices for boycott, include some of the parties, communists, Ayad Allawi bloc, couple other blocs. But the mood is with the election, supporting the election, but there is a fear of what happened 2018.
Explain to our listeners what happened in 2018 that Iraqis today are afraid of being repeated with this election.
And 2018, there's a couple things happen. There's burning the boxes for the vote in the storage places. It happened in one of the large districts here in Baghdad. The government in that time had an urgent session, and then they sent the case to the judiciary system and also to the previous parliament. However, I think the government announced now they already prepare themselves to not repeating the mistakes that happened in the previous election.
Which is a good segue to my next question to you, Farhad, and that's Grand Ayatollah Sistani recent statement encouraging Iraqis to go out and vote. Do you think this will be a game changer in terms of voter turnout? And which of the parties that are contesting the elections you see that they are standing to benefit from this statement, and which parties can lose from this statement?
It will certainly help in terms of having more voters turning up, because those who follow Ayatollah Sistani do listen to what he says and what he instructs them to do, although this was not an instruction per se, because it was encouragement, and that's what the statement said. We encourage people to go and vote. And traditionally, those who follow him are limited in numbers when it comes to segments of Iraqi society. They are first only the Shias. The Kurds or the Sunnis do not really listen or adhere to what Ayatollah Sayyid Sistani says. And within the Shia segment, not all Shias follow his orders. So these are also segmented in terms of those who do not follow him, will not listen to what he says. And then those who go to vote are mostly religious people, and they mostly know the Islamic parties. So I would say that the Islamist parties stand to benefit most from this call for taking part. And mostly I would say Hikmah or Dawlat al-Qanun, Dawah party most likely going to be the benefactors, and maybe some of the others. But I doubt very much if the independents or the secular parties will benefit from that call.
When should we expect the final results to be announced? And once after they are announced, in the past, there has been a protracted government formation process. Do you expect to see the same this time in terms of how long it's going to take to form the government? And what are the plausible scenarios for the government formation process?
The announcement of results is guided and regulated by multiple clauses and articles within the election law as well as the constitution. The election law states that the initial results has to be announced within 24 hours. So we will see the initial results announced by the IHEC within 24 hours. And then they allow time for appeals and complaints about the election process. That usually could take 2 weeks to look into. However, there is an article in the law that says if certain polling centers has to be audited and the votes counted manually, and if there is a discrepancy between manual count and electronic count, then up to 5% or more than 5%, then the entire center has to be all counted manually. So I would imagine that there will be some manual counting going on. And if we go, for whatever reason, go with total manual count for all the constituencies, then that will be a delay of 2 months. However, if we assume that things will go smoothly, then within 2 weeks, we should have the initial results. So that will take us to around 25th of October. So that will be the final results. Then they will send it to the Supreme Court, who will need to approve it. That shouldn't take long. Then the president needs to issue a decree for the first session of the parliament. That also could take up to 15 days, although there's no reason for the president to delay. After that, the first parliamentary session should be convened, and then a speaker will be elected. Traditionally, the first session is kept open because usually there is no political consensus for everything. And I doubt the negotiation for the 3 presidencies will be completed by then. So that session will be kept open. And we have precedents like in 2010, where the whole process took nearly 9 months. In all reality, if we are hopeful and things are not dragged to the last minute with every corner and every article to the absolutely last minute deadline, we should have a government in place by end of October, middle of March. But I doubt it if that will be the case, and we could take longer.
Iraq has had protracted government formation processes. What are your expectations this time? Are we going to see a quicker government formation process? And what are the plausible scenarios from this process?
Well, again, based on this new election law, it's going to be very difficult to have a very large blocks. If you remember in 2010 or 2014 elections, we had a couple of blocks closer to 100 seats, 90 or 89 or something like that. In this election, we're not going to have a very large blocks. A lot of people, include some of the parties' representative, they are talking about much smaller blocks compared to the previous elections. You can look at it from both sides. And again, forming the government depends on a couple steps before that, like selecting a president, selecting the speaker for the parliament. But, if we have 3 to 5 medium blocks, that might lead to, relatively speaking, easy negotiation compared to having 1 or 2 big blocks, and then it's going to be very tough to form a government.
What do you think are the chances of the current Prime Minister, Mr. Mustafa al-Kadhimi's, at returning to office, given the electoral map that exists today, and things can change, of course, coalitions can be built differently, but what do you think are his chances?
Well, he stands a good chance in terms of chances. I mean, he has better chance than most of those names that we've been touted around as possible candidates. But really depend on the process that the political parties will adopt to choose the prime minister. For example, if they go with the what's called as a point system, where number of seats is translated to a point, and then each position, government position, prime minister, then the ministries are priced at a certain point. Then the question would be which political party would be willing to sacrifice their points to give it to the prime minister, and if that prime minister is not one of them. In that scenario, his chances would be difficult because he doesn't have a political bloc that could put up the points in for him. However, it has happened also in the past where the point system didn't include the 3 presidencies, only was adapted to the ministries. then in that case, he has a chance. Or if what happened in 2018, where the two main parties couldn't agree on a possible candidate, so they went to a compromise and they just appointed one person, which was him. That is also a possibility that could happen again. But that will be after long, tough negotiations, and deadlock need to be really the case. Then after that, he could very well come back because the political parties could not agree on a certain candidate.
Do you think this election will have any impact on future relations between Iraq and the United States?
Clearly it does, because depending on who becomes prime minister and who will form the government, one of the hottest issues that's been contested, and some parties made it into their manifesto, is the removal of the foreign troops from Iraq. So it could very well be that some of the political parties will impose the condition of removal of these troops from Iraq as a condition to accept whoever becomes prime minister. In that case, the next prime minister could very well hand over a letter asking the foreign troops to leave. That will have direct impact on the relation with the United States. And that is something that needs to be looked at very carefully.
One final question, and that has to do with election as a pathway for changing a political system like the one that exists in Iraq. I mean, by all measures, this political system is dysfunctional, has not been serving the needs and the interests of the Iraqi people well. And yet, the system has proven to be quite resilient and resistance to reform, as we have seen its ability to really get its act together, through the use of violence, of course, but it was able to sustain the shock or the aftershock of the October protest movement. Do you see elections in a country like Iraq as providing a viable pathway for reforms and changes in the political system?
Election per se does not offer that. Election is mostly really a redistribution of the fortunes of the political parties, but the system remains the same. Whether it is party X or party Y having that number of seats, but in nature, they do not really differ. And what have kept Iraq going and the system surviving despite all the dysfunctionality you mentioned is one little fact, and that is the abundance of money coming from oil revenues that Iraq sells, and that has kept the system going and kept these political parties benefiting, and each one taking a piece of the cake, and therefore maintaining this dysfunctional system. And this election will not offer a radical change for this equation to be disturbed. So we're going to end up with the same equation, more or less. And given the oil price nowadays is in the highest since 2014, this means that they will remain at it, and status quo really is going to be the case.
If you look at the recent, political view, if you can look at what's happened from 2003 until now, it's very, very difficult to see a significant change will happen toward a real reform. However, when I talk to young people, when I talk to people in universities and the malls and streets, Iraqis still hope something will happen after the election that will probably push toward a real economic reform, administrative reform, a real reform that will lead to have an effective, efficient, cohesive government.
Thank you very much for your very insightful remarks and for joining us today on this podcast.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you for the invitation, Randa.
That was MEI Senior Fellow Randa talking to Farhad Alaaldin and Naufel Alhassan. You can follow all of MEI's coverage of the elections and the evolving political situation in Iraq on our website at www.mei.edu. That's all the time we have this week. Thank you to our listeners for tuning in and to our production team for their work on this week's episode. You can follow MEI on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube, and subscribe to our email newsletters for the latest analysis and information about upcoming events. I'm Alistair Taylor. We will see all of you next week.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.